Have you harvested a lot of cucumbers this year and you don't know what to do with them? Well, stick around, I'll show you how to make lacto fermented cucumbers on this episode of Texas 50 Garden, coming up. Howdy, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Texas 50 Garden. My name is Jared. In this episode, we talk about how to make pickles. There's actually two different ways to make pickles. So the first type of pickling I want to talk about is done through a hot water bath or a hot water canning. And the way that works is they take a glass jar and they'll put the cucumbers in there, and then they'll take a vinegar solution, pour it in there, they'll put the lid on, and then they'll put it into a hot water bath. And that hot water bath will cause the lid to stick onto the glass jar, and then they'll take that and they can store that at room temperature for long periods of time. And the way that works is, the reason they can store it for so long is that everything within that glass jar is basically dead. The acidity within the vinegar keeps any kind of microorganisms from growing in there. So basically you have a dead food within this jar, and that's why they're able to store it for long periods of time at room temperature. So the second way to make pickles that I want to talk about is called lacto fermentation. So the way that works is you've got the jar, you put the cucumbers in it, and instead of putting in a vinegar solution, you're going to put in a salt water solution, also known as a brine. And the brine solution is to be a 3.5, anywhere from a 3.5 to a 5% salt to water solution. So you put that in over the cucumbers, and what that's going to do is it's going to inhibit the growth of bad bacteria, but it's going to allow the growth of good bacteria. And the main good bacteria that's growing in there is called Lactobacillus, hence the name Lacto Fermentation. So that Lactobacillus is going to start to eat off of the cucumbers, and it's going to produce lactic acid. And so the pickles are going to be preserved through lactic acid and salt. So this is all done at room temperature, anywhere from 3 to 7 days, and sometimes a little bit longer. You're going to ferment the pickles, and then you're going to put the jar on them and put them in the fridge, and they'll last for a few months. So the way these are, you can't store them at room temperature because the bacteria will keep on eating on them, and after a while you just have a mushy food. So that's why we have to put them in the refrigerator. So now that we've looked at both ways to make pickles, I actually choose the lacto fermentation process over the water bath canning usually. And the reason that is that the lactobacillus, all those probiotics in the brine and in the pickles themselves, that's going to help your digestion. So anytime you consume those probiotics, it's going to be great for your overall health. So let's go ahead and head to the kitchen and get started.
First, we need to make our brine. You will need 1 gallon of non-chlorinated and non-fluoridated water. In this case, I'm using distilled water. You do not want to use tap water, as a lot of times it is chlorinated and fluorinated, and those chemicals will inhibit the growth of good bacteria. You will need half a cup of salt. Ideally, you want to use pickling salt that is free of iodine and anti-caking agents that are present in modern-day table salt. In this batch, I ended up using regular table salt, which does contain iodine and anti-caking agents because I didn't have any pickling salt lying around the house. The table salt will work, however the anti-caking agents can make the brine look more hazy when fermenting. Sea salt will work as well. Simmer the water and then stir in your salt to dissolve it. After dissolving the salt, let your water cool back down close to room temperature. Next, we want to cut up our cucumbers. Start by cutting off both ends of the cucumber. It is critical to make sure you cut off the ends because they contain an enzyme that will increase the rate of fermentation and cause your pickles to be soggy. I usually like to cut my cucumbers into fourths. Also, I cut the seeds out of the large cucumbers because I don't enjoy eating the large seeds. However, it doesn't hurt to leave the seeds in. You can leave the cucumbers whole, however you won't be able to fit as many in the jar, and they will take longer to ferment. The smaller you cut your cucumbers up, the more surface area will be in contact with the brine, and the faster it will ferment. The equipment we'll be using for our fermentation includes 1 quart wide-mouth mason jars with lids and rings. I like to use the wide-mouth jars versus the small-mouth because it is easier to pack the cucumbers into the jar. We will also be using glass weights made specifically for fermenting in wide-mouth mason jars. The purpose of the weights is to keep the cucumbers below the top of the brine and away from the air. Keeping the cucumbers in an anaerobic environment is critical to prevent them from spoiling. Make sure to get wide-mouth mason jars because the wide-mouth weights will not fit into small-mouth mason jars. Before beginning our ferment, we want to make sure to thoroughly wash our lids and jars in either the dishwasher or with soap and water in the sink. It is not necessary to sterilize your jars in boiling water before fermenting. Soap and water is enough. The ingredients we'll be putting into our jars include oak leaves that will help keep our pickles crunchy by releasing tannins into the brine solution. If you don't have any oak trees on your property, you can use bay leaves or grape leaves. We will also be adding our spices to enhance the flavor. In this batch I will be using fresh garlic, dill, and red pepper flakes. You can choose to use any number of spices. Some popular spices for fermenting pickles include caraway seeds, mustard seeds, and peppercorn. Of course, we will also have our freshly cut cucumbers. While our brine is cooling, we are going to take our 2 oak leaves and place them on the bottom of the mason jar. Then we will add our spices, then pack as many cucumbers into the jar as we can. Before putting our brine into jars, we need to measure to see whether our weights fit inside the jar. If the cucumbers are too tall, we will need to cut a small section of the cucumber off until if the weights fit into the jar. Once our brine is cooled, we will take a ladle and carefully pour our brine into jars, completely covering our cucumbers. You do not want your cucumbers to be exposed to air, as they will quickly mold. Next, gently place our weight on top of the cucumbers. The purpose of the weight is to keep the cucumbers under the brine solution and away from the air. Don't make a mess like I just did there. Use a mason jar funnel in order to prevent the brine from going all over the outside of the jars and all over the table. Finally, take a clean mason jar lid and place it on top. Then gently screw the ring onto the lid. You want to have the ring on the jar so that the lid fits loosely to the jar. While the cucumbers are fermenting, they will give off gases, and having the lid loosely on the jar allows these gases to escape, while at the same time gravity keeps the lid on the jar and helps prevent outside air from going into the jar. While the cucumbers are fermenting, the gases in the jar will vent through the lid and also cause some of the brine to leak out of the top of the jar. To prevent a mess, you can put your jars on a cookie sheet with a towel on it. You can also place a towel loosely on top of the jars to prevent light from entering. Light inhibits the growth of the good bacteria in our fermentation process, so we want to keep our jars in a dark environment, whether that is keeping the jars in a dark closet or draping a towel over them.
So after about 3 days, you can go ahead and check your pickles and see if they have the right sourness and the right crunchiness that you want. And once they do have that, go ahead and put the lid on them and put them in the fridge. I usually like to let mine sit for anywhere from 3 to 7 days. This particular batch here has been sitting for 7 days, and I tasted it and it has the right flavor and the right texture that I want. As you'll notice too, the pickles, they start off of this more dark green color, and since they've been in there for 7 days, they've gotten more of an olive or yellow color, and that's normal. The other thing is that the brine has become a lot hazier. And there's 2 reasons why the brine becomes hazy, or at least in this particular batch. The first one is because all those good bacteria are populating and growing, and so that's going to cause the haziness, and that's totally normal. That's what you want. The second reason that this particular batch that I made is so hazy is that I used the table salt instead of using the pickle salt. And so the table salt has all those anti-caking agents, and that's gonna cause it to be more hazy. So if you want less hazy brine, make sure you use pickling salt instead of table salt. So I've got the right texture and the right flavor on these. We'll put the lid on and put them in the fridge.
Now we come to the part of pickling that scares people. Sometimes you will get mold on top of the brine solution. Mold spores range in size from 3 to 40 microns. The naked human eye can only see objects 40 microns or larger. So there are actually mold spores all around us, we just can't see them. The problem comes when we have an overgrowth of mold. Some of the jars in this particular batch probably got mold on the surface of the brine for 2 reasons. It is July here in Texas, and the temperatures outside are getting up into the high 90s. So in the mid-afternoon, my air conditioner has problems keeping up with the heat, and it will get over 76 degrees in the house. The ideal temperature for fermenting is between 65 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The other possible reason is that I used dried dill, and some of which floated up and around the weight to the top of the brine and possibly fed the mold. To prevent this, I should have used whole dill that would have stayed under the pickles. From the research I've done, as long as your salt to water ratio is correct in your brine and the pickles have stayed submerged in the brine, the actual pickles should be free of mold. To get any mold or potential mold off the top of the brine, simply place the entire jar into the sink and then take some non-chlorinated, non-fluoridated water and slowly pour it into the jar. This will displace the water at the top of the jar, and any mold should overflow out of the jar and into the sink. The pickles should still be edible as long as they stay below the surface of the brine. However, if you are sensitive to mold or have a compromised immune system, you might want to play it safe and not eat that particular batch and start over, paying close attention to keep the temperature between 65 to 70 degrees and keeping everything under the brine. Also, if you are sensitive to mold, they do make airlock systems that help prevent mold from forming on the top. I plan on purchasing the pickle pipe airlock tops made by Mason Tops and doing a review on them in the near future, so make sure to subscribe so you can get notified when I come out with that video. After you've gotten the mold off of the surface of the brine, make sure to wash the lids with soap and water. Next, tighten the lids on the mason jars and place them in the refrigerator. You can leave the weights on the jars to prevent the pickles from rising out of the brine. Once you place the pickles in the refrigerator, the growth of the good bacteria will slow down, and so will the fermentation process. I try to consume the pickles within 1 to 2 months. I've not found a specific concrete number on how long the fermented pickles will keep. Every batch is going to be a little different, so it's hard to pinpoint when the pickles will no longer be edible. I would say try to consume them within 2 months to be safe.
So all the equipment and ingredients I used in this video are going to be in the description below. Also, I have put a few articles for any concerns or questions you might have regarding lacto fermentation. So until next time, God bless and have a good day.